So yeah, we're moving forward with the theme of Revolutionary King's Chapel with our subheading, Re-examining the Church's Religious History and Reform in the Age of the American Revolution. And today's topic forms kind of an important bridge between the broader history of King's Chapel's community in the era of independence, like we talked about last week, and the independent spirit within the King's Chapel community and theology in the 1780s. It's difficult to talk about this time in the church's history without at least mentioning Reverend Henry Kaner and his departure from Boston. Yet Kaner in some ways remains a bit of an elusive character to many. In his nearly 30 years as minister of the church, he presided over the chapel during a critical era in the church's history. Little did he know at that time, however, that his tenure would end abruptly amidst the American Revolution and pave the way for the religious revolution within King's Chapel itself. And so in today's presentation, I'll dive deeper into Reverend Henry Kaner and exploring his life, legacy, career, and controversies before, during, and after his tenure as King's Chapel's minister. So this image will probably pop up a lot through the conversation. This is the only known image we have of Reverend Henry Kaner, but it's in a very typical style of ministers' portraits from the 18th century. So looks very similar to a lot of his colleagues. But here we have Kaner. Not much is known about his early roots or early life prior to his arrival at Yale in the 1720s. Kaner is thought to have been born around 1700, which would have brought him to a pretty impressive age of 92 or 93 at the time of his death. Some sources indicate that Henry Kaner was born in England and emigrated to Connecticut with his father, who worked as a craftsman while he was a child. But by 1724, Henry Kaner had graduated from Yale, which would have interestingly placed him there as a student during the presidency of Timothy Cutler, who became rector of Christ Church, Boston, which is better known as the Old North Church, in 1723, who Kaner would later become a close colleague of. After finishing his studies, he spent the next few years living with a former tutor, still in Connecticut, working as a schoolmaster located in Fairfield. By 1727, Henry Kaner had traveled to England, where he was ordained in the Anglican Church before returning back to Connecticut to work as a missionary for the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. This is the logo of this organization. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel was founded in 1701, in part by Reverend Thomas Bray, whose name some may recognize as the organizer of the theological library that was gifted to King's Chapel that now resides at the Boston Athenaeum. But the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel essentially had three aims: to support Anglican clergy abroad, to undertake conversion efforts of indigenous and enslaved peoples, and to oversee charitable funds provided to the society. While I'm unfortunately a bit limited in terms of resources by the pandemic, as well as primary materials for a lot of these organizations being located in England, I have found some secondary references of Kaner's missionary work involving conversion attempts with Native Americans and enslaved people in the area of Fairfield, Connecticut. I'm hoping in the future I'll be able to do some more research into his role within the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. But we do know as well that during his time as minister of King's Chapel, Kaner had baptized at least 38 enslaved men, women, and children within his own church. And in his early years at King's Chapel, we also know that Henry Kaner and his wife Anne enslaved at least 4 people within their home, who were Annville, Pompey, and Pompey. In terms of his personal life, we know that Kaner married a woman named Anne, who unfortunately passed away in 1752 during his early years at King's Chapel when she was 46. The couple had at least one daughter as well, who would later flee Boston during the American Revolution with her father. But following about 20 years of missionary work in Connecticut, in 1747, Kaner was appointed the rector of King's Chapel, where he remained for nearly 30 years, leaving his post during, of course, the American Revolution. In many ways, Kaner's tenure as King's Chapel's minister was marked by change and growth, one of the most major of which was the construction of the stone chapel. While efforts had been taken prior to his arrival towards rebuilding the church, the efforts were revamped upon his arrival, and records indicate that Reverend Kaner had personal correspondence with the chapel's architect, Peter Harrison, describing the church community's preferences and considerations for construction. And within 2 years of his arrival at King's Chapel, over 5-year project was underway to reinvent the original wooden building into the grand granite structure that King's Chapel still calls home today. There are kind of 2 components of his career during his time at King's Chapel that are often overlooked that I find particularly interesting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those before kind of getting into his later years. And these include one being his close involvement in overseeing the Old North Church throughout his time in Boston, as well as his involvement in the Mayhew controversy in the years preceding the American Revolution. So more so than other Anglican offshoots in the Boston area, King's Chapel retained close ties with the Old North Church throughout the 18th century. A particularly important example of this is during the 1750s and 1760s, when the Old North's minister, a man named Reverend Timothy Cutler, who I mentioned earlier in the context of Yale, he fell ill and was unable to fulfill his duties to his congregation. Although it's not explicitly stated, the records of his illness make it sound as if he may have suffered from a stroke. By the late 1750s, Reverend Cutler is described as, quote, an aged minister, long disabled by paralysis, totally disabled for years from his sacred functions. Urgent letters from the wardens and vestry of Christ Church or Old North, such as the one you see on your screen, discuss Cutler is incapable of fulfilling his duties. So this letter here, which is dated May 1758, begins by talking about how, quote, the present condition of Christ Church in this town is very unhappy. Dr. Cutler has been incapable of public duty for above 2 years, and there is not the least probability that he will ever be able to officiate again. Our chief dependence has been upon Mr. Kaner and Master Troutbeck, who, besides supplying the church occasionally, have now performed the whole duty of the parish for a full year, a burden which they have submitted to from mere moves of charity, in which we cannot expect them, they will much longer continue. So during this era, we see here that Kaner, as Kaner and Troutbeck worked to supply Old North's pulpit, in addition to running King's Chapel, so 2 pretty large-scale congregations in Boston at the time. They're meeting regularly with the vestry of the Old North Church, searching for an assistant minister to help out during Cutler's tenure. Interestingly, during this era of King's Chapel's very close involvement at the Old North Church is when several of kind of the more notable pre-revolutionary events of note take place at the Old North Church, one being the story of John Childs essentially ziplining from the roof of the church, which is a story they often tell tours there, as well as the time in their history when a church member and privateer donated a number of looted goods to the Old North Church, including angels that still sit in front of their pipe organ today. So that'll happen kind of during the 1750s. A side note that I find very interesting about this time too comes from kind of the conversations and attempts to secure an assistant minister for the Old North Church. There's this record in the King's Chapel Annals, written in the 1880s by Reverend Henry Wilder Foote, that talks about a kind of attempt by a man to kind of take control over the Old North Church as minister, but describes this man as, quote, a vagrant clergyman named McClanahan, who gave Dr. Kaner much uneasiness by his schemes to capture the pulpit. And essentially, this is a society for the propagation of the gospel missionary who was stationed in Kennebunk, Maine. But instead of fulfilling his missionary duties there, he traveled through cities in the East Coast looking for a pulpit to preach from, as well as selling what was described in contemporary letters as quote, quack medicines. Very kind of strange experience there that Kaner unfortunately had to deal with. Kaner essentially threatened to report this man for kind of abandoning his missionary duties, and ultimately told him that he needs to leave New England. And it ended up happening that way. So kind of an interesting story there found in the archives. And other kind of interesting, here is also when Timothy Cutler eventually died in 1765, before being buried beneath the chancel of the Old North Church, Henry Kaner, as you can see here, preached his funeral sermon, and due to their close relationship, he also received a piece of mourning jewelry in memory of Timothy Cutler, which was very common practice amongst Anglo-Americans at that time. This is the title page from the published sermon. The other kind of moments in Kaner's career at King's Chapel that is pretty interesting is known as the Mayhew controversy, which is actually quite complex and could be an entire topic on its own. So please bear with me and keep this in mind during my very brief summary, but it's essentially centered around the notion of installing an Anglican bishop in the American colonies. Partly in response to the Anglican organization, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which, as I mentioned, Kaner was involved with in his early career. New England Congregationalists who emerged from the Puritan tradition had begun their own very similar organization called the Society for Propagating the Gospel among the Indians of North America, which aims to convert indigenous peoples in New England to Congregationalism rather than Anglicanism, though the Society's charter was soon revoked by the Archbishop of Canterbury because of its conflicts with the interests of the English Church. After Reverend Kaner's colleague in Cambridge, Reverend East Apthorpe, published a pamphlet in support of converting Native Americans to Anglicanism, a Congregationalist minister in the region, that's the wrong slide, but I will go back to that later. Never mind, I don't have a picture. Oh, here he is. This is Jonathan Mayhew, Congregationalist minister. He objected to the revocation of this Congregationalist society and argued, kind of made a very public argument through writings about an Anglican conspiracy to install bishops in the colonies. Reverend Henry Kaner entered this conversation and very publicly critiqued the views of Mayhew and essentially accused him of heresy as well as instigating an attack on the Anglican Church in America. It's a lot more complex than this, but it's just kind of this really interesting example of these kind of rising tensions throughout the colonies on various topics as we get into the 1760s, approaching the American Revolution. As I said, it falls into a broader series of tensions and debates over colonial autonomy versus British authority during this pre-revolutionary era, and in many ways casts public light on Kaner's strong loyalties to Britain leading up to the American Revolution, as he continued throughout this period to vigorously defend the Anglican Church through published writings. As we get to the Revolutionary era, this is of course kind of the best known and most discussed period of Kaner's involvement as King's Chapel senior minister. As I mentioned, in regards to the Mayhew controversy, Kaner was very vocally opposed to the political upheaval in Boston during the years leading up to the war. And following the arrival of British troops and sailors in Boston, King's Chapel's marriage and burial registers attest to this influx of British officers and military members who found a spiritual home within his congregation. I used this slide last week, but it works again here, where we see kind of these increased references of marriages and burials of members of the British military who have become connected to the King's Chapel congregation during this period. As we also saw last week in talking about Kaner's departure, his last entry in the King's Chapel Register of Marriages, describing kind of his departure from King's Chapel due to the war. Quote, he writes there, "An unnatural rebellion of the colonies against His Majesty's government obliged the loyal part of the subjects to evacuate their dwellings. Public worship at King's Chapel became suspended and is likely to remain so till it shall please God to change the hearts of the rebels or give success to His Majesty's arms." In a letter a couple months later, so this is dated March 10th, 1776. In May 10th, 1776, he wrote a letter from Halifax, Nova Scotia, providing kind of more details about his departure. And I think it's interesting to see it in his own words, so I'll just read this briefly. Pardon the typo in the first line, which I just noticed. But as to the clergy of Boston, indeed, they have for 11 months past been exposed to difficulty and distress in every shape. And as to myself, having determined to maintain my post as long as possible, I continue to officiate to the small remains of my parishioners, though without support, until the 10th of March, when I suddenly and unexpectedly received notice that King's troops would immediately evacuate the town. It is not easy to paint the distress and confusion of the inhabitants on that occasion. I had but 6 or 7 hours allowed to prepare for this measure, being obliged to embark the same day for Halifax, where we arrived the 1st of April. The sudden movement prevented me from saving my books, furniture, or any part of my interest, except bedding, wearing apparel, and little provision for my small family during the passage. We do know, of course, though, that Kaner, although he was able to protect much of his personal possessions, was able to protect a number of valuable possessions belonging to King's Chapel, including the vital registers and other church records, communion silver, and church linens, which the remaining congregation would later attempt to reclaim in the 1780s and 1790s. His personal estate, including a home located on the site of the Boston Athenaeum, was confiscated by Massachusetts in 1778, and Kaner at that time was also banished as one of the loyalists, forbidden from returning to Boston. While King's Chapel was eventually able to secure the return of the church registers and records, the communion silver, as many of us know, was another story. On the screen now, you're looking at an inventory of items taken by Kaner when he fled Boston in 1776. This was prepared by the vestry wardens in the early 1780s as they worked to place claims for the return of these valuable pieces of the church's history and material culture. Kaner initially left the silver behind in Halifax with a colleague named Reverend for safekeeping, while Kaner and his family were traveling from Nova Scotia to England. Ultimately, the silver, though, was repossessed by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel and distributed among churches in Britain's remaining colonies throughout Anglican churches in Canada. But what of Kaner's life in England after the American Revolution and before his death? My last. At some point between the death of Anne in 1752, who I mentioned earlier, and 1785, Kaner did remarry. A letter from a friend penned in 1787 mentions, or 1785, excuse me, mentions that Kaner and, quote, his young wife, end quote, had retired to Cardiff in Wales. So initially he did head to London, but he's being placed in Wales later on in his life. Kaner died either in late 1792 or early 1793. Surviving, as I mentioned at the very beginning, to the impressive age of either 92 or 93 years old. An article from the Boston Gazette from February 1793 mentions his death, as one of his daughters lived in Boston with her husband. According to Henry Wilder Foote in the Church Annals, he found references that Kaner died in Somersetshire in England, but was unable to confirm the location of Kaner's grave. Although other accounts say that he died in London, but of course we have him placed in Wales a little bit before his death as well. Regardless of where he ultimately resided in the 1790s, we do know that he lived out the rest of his days in England, never returning to his home church of King's Chapel. So as I come to a close, I think it's really interesting to talk about Henry Kaner and kind of learn more about his life and career at King's Chapel. He holds a very kind of interesting role in the church during this period of upheaval and transition as the church's last Anglican minister. And his departure, of course, leads the way towards the arrival of James Freeman and the kind of ongoing growth and transitions within the church in the years following the American Revolution. Kaner was one of about 18 Anglican ministers who left the Boston area around the time of the American Revolution. And in Boston, we know that only Trinity Church retained an assistant minister. So Kaner has a very kind of common experience in many ways with the Anglican and clergy elite at the time. But his departure, of course, as I said, kind of sets us up for the history that we'll be looking at in future weeks as we look more closely at Anglicanism in the age of the American Revolution, not just at King's Chapel, but more broadly throughout the colonies, as well as kind of diving deeper into the church's transition under the leadership of James Freeman to become